The new revelation of Peace Messiah, to end the war in Ukraine and Russia. The Russian invasion of Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion on Ukraine from the north, east and south sides of Ukraine in the name of Special Military Operation. It provoked broad international protest and severe economic sanctions against Russia from the Western world. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, and over 10 million Ukrainian people have lost their homes and became refugees. Now it's time to end this war between these two historical brotherly nations, and stop the war from escalating into a nuclear catastrophe for both nations and for the world. To find the peaceful solution to this conflict in Ukraine, we need to first look at the history of Russia and Ukraine and find out the root of this conflict, and then find the solution to end this conflict once for all. The revelation of Messiah for Russia and Ukraine. 1. The history of Russia and Ukraine. 2. The causes of conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. 3. The solution to end the war in Ukraine. 1. The history of Russia and Ukraine. 1. The Kievan Rus Federation, 800s to 1240 AD. During the first millennium, some Slavs tribes settled in the East European plain from Black Sea to Baltic Sea. In the 8th century, the migrants from Scandinavia, also known as Varangians or Vikings, expanded their settlement to Eastern Europe and formed the medieval federation of Kievan Rus. Its original capital was settled at Novgorod and then moved to Kiev in 882 AD. Kievan Rus became the common ancestor of modern-day Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. In the 10th century, Vladimir the Great took power and formed an alliance with the Byzantine Empire. He also led Kievan Rus to convert to Christianity and introduced the Byzantine culture to Kievan Rus. The synthesis of Byzantine and Slavic cultures led to the cultural and economic golden age for Kievan Rus. 2. The Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, 13th century. In the 13th century, the Mongol army invaded and conquered Kievan Rus and destroyed many cities in Kievan Rus. Kiev, the capital city of Kievan Rus, was completely destroyed in 1240. The rest of Kievan Rus submitted to the Mongol Empire, the Khanate of the Golden Horde, 1240 to 1480. 3. The Principality of Moscow/Muscovy, 1263 to 1547 AD. In the 14th century, the Principality of Moscow became the leading principality among Russian principalities, and was in charge of collecting tribute for the Khan of the Golden Horde, which increased Moscow's wealth. In the 15th century, the Grand Principality or Grand Duchy of Moscow grew stronger from a vassal state of the Golden Horde Khanate, 1263 to 1480, to a sovereign state of Muscovy with its capital at Moscow, 1480 to 1547. 4. The Tsardom of Russia, 1547 to 1721 AD, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, 1569 to 1791 AD. In 1547, Ivan IV was crowned the Tsar and Grand Prince of all Russia, thereby proclaiming the Tsardom of Russia to replace the Grand Principality of Moscow. In 1569, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania formed the Union of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which became one of the largest and most populated countries in 16th to 17th centuries Europe. It occupied the large territory covering the current Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus and western/central Ukraine. 5. The Russian Empire, 1721 to 1918 AD. In 1648, the Cossack of Ukraine rebelled against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. With the help from Russia, they took eastern Ukraine to join the Tsardom of Russia in 1686. In 1721, Peter the Great transformed the Tsardom of Russia into the Russian Empire and began the expansion to the west through a series of wars. During the 17th to 18th century, the Russian Empire defeated the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and gradually acquired large territory in Eastern Europe, including most of Ukraine. 6. The Soviet Union, 1918 to 1991 AD. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Russian Empire was overthrown and replaced by the Russian Republic, which later was turned into the Soviet Union in 1922 after the Civil War within the Russian Republic. Ukraine also became part of the Soviet Union after the Russian/Ukrainian Civil War between 1918 and 1922. During the Soviet Union period, Lenin, Stalin and Khrushchev merged some Soviet territories into Ukraine, with the latest gift of Crimea given by Khrushchev to Ukraine in 1954 as the symbol of close ties between the two brotherly nations. During World War II, 1939 to 1945, Russians and Ukrainians fought together against the Nazi Germany and built a strong brotherly bond between the two nations. So Stalin merged some Western territory to Ukraine after the end of World War II in 1945. The two Soviet leaders following Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev, were also born in Ukraine and brought up through the Ukrainian party system. That's the best time of the brotherhood between the two nations. That's why Khrushchev gifted Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. 7. The Independent Ukraine, 1991, now. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, Ukraine became an independent country in 1991 but still maintained a good relationship with Russia. However, as Western Ukrainians mostly speak Ukrainian language and pro-Europe, and the majority of Eastern Ukrainians speak Russian and pro-Russia, it sowed the seed of separatism in Eastern Ukraine after 2014. 2. The causes of conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. The historical conflicts that impacted the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Although Ukrainians and Russians have had the same ancestors and the same culture for over 1,000 years, there were still some historical conflicts that had a lasting impact on the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. The most significant ones started with the Soviet-Ukrainian War in 1917–1921 and the Holodomor in 1932–1933. 1. The Soviet-Ukrainian War/Independent War, 1917–1921. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Ukrainians declared autonomy from the Soviet Russia as the Ukrainian People's Republic in 1917. The Bolshevik government led by Lenin considered it as a counter-revolution government and did not accept its autonomy. In January 1918, Ukrainians declared independence from the Soviet Russia. The war broke out and eventually the Soviet Red Army, along with Kievan Bolshevik, won the war, and the Ukraine People's Republic became part of the Soviet Union in 1922. 2. The Holodomor, the Terror Famine, in Ukraine, 1932–1933. During 1932 and 1933, a great famine occurred in the Soviet Union and the Soviet government took the grains from Ukraine to export to raise funds for its economic plan. Stalin rejected the outside aid to Ukraine, confiscated household food from peasants, and restricted Ukrainians from moving out to seek food, which caused 3 to 5 million Ukrainians starving to death. The Holodomor was a man-made terror famine, in addition to the natural famine, caused by Joseph Stalin, as he thought those ethnic Ukrainians in the western Ukraine were not loyal to his regime. Joseph Stalin is one of the most murderous leaders in the world history. During his reign of Soviet Union, about 20 million people were killed or persecuted to death under his order, including those 3 to 5 million Ukrainians starved to death during the Holodomor. During World War II, while the majority of Ukrainians joined the Soviet armies to fight with Nazi Germany, some Ukrainians joined the German armies to fight the Soviet armies in revenge of Stalin's starvation of Ukrainians. Some Ukrainian nationalists, led by Stepan Bandera, collaborated with Nazi Germany in hope to gain independence from the Soviet Union. That's the root of neo-Nazism in Ukraine today. The Holodomor is a deep pain in the memory of Ukrainians, just like the Holocaust is a deep pain in the memory of Jews. After the independence of Ukraine from the dissolved Soviet Union in 1991, many Ukrainians began to commemorate the Holodomor, and some of them turned into Ukrainian nationalists. Unfortunately, a small fraction of them turned into the extremists of neo-Nazism. 3. The Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity in 2014. After the independence of Ukraine, most government officials became corrupted like those Russian oligarchs and plunged Ukraine into economic stagnancy. In November 2013, Ukrainians started the Euromaidan protests against its government after the president backed out of a deal with the European Union. In February 2014, Ukrainians started the Revolution of Dignity, also called Maidan or Euromaidan Revolution, to oust the pro-Russia President Yanukovych. 4. The annexation of Crimea. After Ukrainians ousted the pro-Russia president, the ethnic Russians in eastern and southern Ukraine started rallies against the new government. Amid the rising anti-Russia sentiment in Ukraine, Putin decided to take back Crimea where his Black Sea Fleet was stationed. On March 1, 2014, Putin deployed the Russian troops to Crimea and had complete control of Crimea. On March 16, 2014, Crimea conducted a referendum to declare independence from Ukraine to join Russia with 96.7% approval rate on 83.1% turnout. On March 18, 2014, Crimea was annexed into Russia, but both Ukraine and the United Nations do not recognize this annexation. 5. The separatism in eastern Ukraine. After the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, the Russian-speaking people in Donetsk and Luhansk regions also held referendums to be independent from the new pro-West Ukraine and rejoin Russia. But Russia did not accept it this time as it did to Crimea in hope to keep the tie with Ukraine. In the next 8 years, the Ukrainian troops and volunteer militias were sent to the region to fight Russian-supported separatists, which caused over 13,000 deaths, including 3,393 civilians, mostly ethnic Russians. According to the UN report. 6. The nationalism and neo-Nazism in Ukraine. Since the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the rebellion of the separatists in eastern Ukraine in 2014, the nationalism of Ukraine has risen among Ukrainians. Besides the traditional patriotism and nationalism for Ukraine, some people resorted to the extremist groups of neo-Nazism, especially during the conflicts with the separatists in eastern Ukraine. Some of the militants even carried out brutal killing of ethnic Russian civilians in eastern Ukraine, which enraged Russians in Russia calling for the war. That's one of the excuses that Putin used for denazification of Ukraine in his special military operation against Ukraine. 7. The new language law. In 2019, Ukraine passed the new language law that requires all government officials, print media, schools, and service sectors to speak or use Ukrainian language and sets the restrictions on Russian language in public usage. The law also imposes fines on business entities for non-compliance with the law in the field of customer service. That caused some great resentment among 40% Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. Russia also condemned the law in the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. It became another reason for Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. 8. Ukraine's desire to join NATO. After losing Crimea and the battles with the separatists backed by Russians in eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian government has more urgency than before to join NATO. But Russia strongly opposes Ukraine joining NATO in fear of NATO having a military presence at its doorstep, and Ukraine using NATO to help them take back Crimea. That's another main cause that led to Russia's full-scale invasion into Ukraine, trying to stop Ukraine from joining NATO. 9. Putin's ambition for a new Russian Empire. Putin has an ambitious dream to rebuild the Russian Empire as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great did hundreds of years ago. But the time has changed. It's time for the new millennium of peace and wisdom, not the time for military dominance over other countries. Unfortunately, Putin's ambitious but obsolete dream of a new Russian Empire has turned into a nightmare for Russia. It's time for Mr. Putin to recognize the reality and have the courage to end this war, otherwise he will be remembered in Russian history as the one who destroyed Russia's economy and isolated Russia from the world, unlike Peter the Great who embraced the West for a modernized Russia. 3. The solution to end the war in Ukraine. 1. The world must work together to end this war in Ukraine. No country has the right to invade a sovereign nation just because of its own security concern. Putin underestimated the resolve of courageous Ukrainians to fight for their country, and miscalculated the unity of the international community standing behind Ukraine for peace and justice. To prevent this war from escalating out of control, all nations should work together to push for a peaceful solution to end this war. 2. Stop the war now to prevent the nuclear World War III. Now, as the war in Ukraine has dragged on for almost 3 years, NATO has promised to fully support Ukraine with more advanced missiles, and Russia has threatened to use nuclear weapons to strike NATO countries in retaliation. There is a great risk for this regional war escalating out of control into a nuclear catastrophe for the world. Then, the human civilization on Earth, including both splendid European culture and Russian culture, could perish in such a nuclear catastrophe. Therefore, it is important to find a peaceful solution to end this war in Ukraine before it escalates into a catastrophic nuclear World War III. 3. Put people's life above territorial dispute. In the last 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2024, there is an estimate about 200,000 Russian troops killed and about 500,000 wounded in this war, while Ukraine suffered around 100,000 deaths and 400,000 wounded. If the war continues, it could cause much more casualties and damages for both nations. The main roadblock to the ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine is the territorial dispute over Crimea and the 4 oblasts, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, in southeast Ukraine, which are currently occupied by Russian troops. To solve this problem, we need to dig deeper to the root of this territorial dispute and conflict. 4. Respect people's will to remain in Ukraine or join Russia. This is the map of the Ukrainian population which speaks Russian natively during the Ukraine presidential election in 2010. Over 70% of population in Crimea and Donetsk speak Russian natively, over 90% of population in Sevastopol speak Russian natively, and over 50% of population in Luhansk speak Russian natively. That's why the people in these regions overwhelmingly favored the idea of returning to Russia in the referendum after the Euromaidan revolution in 2014. Other eastern oblasts of Ukraine have less than 50% of population speak Russian natively, thus the majority of residents prefer to remain in Ukraine. Therefore, the best way to settle the conflicts and end this war in Ukraine is to respect people's will to remain in Ukraine or join Russia through referendums. Vox Populi, Vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. 5. The settlement of territorial disputes according to people's will. A. The settlement on Crimea. According to the referendum in 2014 after the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, over 90% of the voters in Crimea approved the referendum to return Crimea to Russia. Therefore, let's respect the Crimean people's will to join Russia and accept Crimea as part of Russia now. However, due to its historical ties to Ukraine, the Russian government should grant Ukrainian citizens the equal right as Russian citizens to travel, work and live in Crimea. B. The settlement on the 4 oblasts of southeast Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. According to the referendums in 2014 before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, majority people in Donetsk and Luhansk wanted to return to Russia. Although Zaporizhia and Kherson also held similar referendums after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, these referendums under military occupation should not be counted as the free referendum of the majority Ukrainian people in the region. Therefore, the fair way to settle the dispute on these 4 oblasts is to let Russia and Ukraine split the 4 oblasts, with Russia keeping Donetsk and Luhansk while Ukraine taking back the Russian-occupied Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. 6. Ukraine should join European Union but not NATO for now. A. Ukraine should join European Union. Due to the cause of this war between Ukraine and Russia starting with the Euromaidan revolution in 2014 with the majority of Ukrainians favoring the European Union over Russia, the European Union should open its door to Ukraine, especially after Ukraine has suffered great loss since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. It will take a lot of foreign aid and investment to rebuild Ukraine. It's better for Ukraine to join the European Union for post-war recovery and economic development. B. Ukraine should not join NATO for now. According to the rules of NATO, it cannot accept a country in the war as a new member of NATO. Therefore, Ukraine could not join NATO while still at war with Russia. It's better for Ukraine to remain neutral as a buffer zone between NATO and Russia to avoid direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. However, with all the NATO countries standing behind Ukraine, NATO could serve as a deterring factor and critical safeguard against further aggression by Russia. 7. Russia should compensate Ukraine for the war damage. Since Russia has caused huge damage to Ukraine in its invasion of Ukraine, Russia should compensate Ukraine with its oil and natural gas production passing through Ukraine. It's time to end the war in Ukraine now. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, hundreds of thousands of people have died and over 10 million people have lost their homes. Both Russia and Ukraine suffered huge losses in this war. It's time for Russia and Ukraine to end this war now with a peace agreement according to the new revelation of Peace Messiah for the new millennium. God has mercy on the people suffering in the war. So, be merciful, just as your heavenly Father is merciful. Luke 6 verse 36. It's time to end the war between these two brotherly nations, and start to rebuild the war-torn countries after this unnecessary war. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Matthew 5 verse 9. Jesus Christ. For more information about the new revelation of Peace Messiah, for the new millennium of peace and wisdom, please visit www.peacemessiah.org.